Before you decide what to believe, listen carefully to how this story actually begins. Not with a runway packed with cameras, not with press releases or official confirmations, but with a flight log that shouldn't exist. According to documents circulated quietly among aviation forums, an experimental aircraft remained airborne far longer than any conventional fuel-based system should allow. Not hours longer, not a marginal record. Days. 72 hours in the air, without a refueling stop that anyone could independently verify. And that's where the controversy ignites. Because in aviation, endurance isn't just a number. It's physics. It's fuel mass, thermal limits, structural fatigue, pilot viability, and energy balance. Every certified aircraft on Earth lives inside those constraints. Break one and the rest collapse. Yet this flight didn't collapse. At least, not on paper. What makes this case different isn't the claim itself. Aviation history is full of bold claims. It's the silence that followed. No triumphant media tour. No official challenge to existing records. Just fragments, telemetry screenshots, partial radar paths, ground observer testimony, and a technology description that refuses to fit neatly into any known category. Some engineers dismissed it immediately. Others didn't, because a handful of details didn't behave like a hoax. For one, the reported altitude remained stable across long durations where conventional aircraft would be forced to descend due to fuel burn-off and weight redistribution. Thermal signatures, where available, didn't spike the way hybrid or solar-assisted systems typically do under prolonged load. And then there's the power question. Every aircraft that stays airborne must answer it. Where does the energy come from continuously? Officially, no new propulsion class has been certified that would allow a 3-day flight without either fuel, external refueling, or massive solar surface area. This aircraft allegedly used none of those in a conventional sense, which is why skeptics argue the logs must be incomplete, or altered, or misunderstood. But here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Several independent observers, not affiliated with the project, reported visual confirmation of the aircraft at different time intervals across multiple regions. Not continuously, not tracked cleanly, but consistently enough to suggest something was in the sky when it shouldn't have been. And that forces a harder question. If the flight didn't happen as claimed, why hasn't it been decisively disproven? Aviation authorities are excellent at debunking false records. Transponders, radar archives, airspace logs, the tools exist. Yet no comprehensive rebuttal has surfaced. Only statements that the flight is unverified, uncertified, or outside existing frameworks. Carefully chosen words. Because unverified doesn't mean impossible, and outside existing frameworks doesn't mean false. It means inconvenient, especially if the underlying concept, even partially, challenges assumptions the entire aviation ecosystem is built on. Fuel logistics, range, economics, military endurance, surveillance platforms, cargo routing. If sustained flight without conventional fuel were even marginally viable, it wouldn't just change aviation records. It would rewrite strategy. Which brings us to the most divisive part of the story, the technology explanation itself. A system described not as a single engine but as an energy environment. One that interacts with atmospheric, electromagnetic, or ambient sources in a way current certification models don't account for. To some, that's pseudoscience. To others, it sounds uncomfortably like early radar, early jet propulsion, early fly-by-wire, all ideas that were once dismissed because they didn't fit existing rulebooks. And that's why this flight, real or not, refuses to disappear. Because every time someone tries to reduce it to a simple hoax, another unresolved detail surfaces. Another data point that doesn't align with easy debunking. So the question isn't just whether the aircraft stayed airborne for 72 hours. It's why no one seems eager to fully open the case. And why, despite the controversy, engineers on both sides keep watching the same fragments, running the same calculations, and quietly admitting one thing. Because the most disruptive ideas in aviation history never arrive with consensus, they arrive with discomfort. And that's exactly where this story now sits. In the months following the alleged flight, something subtle began to happen. Not public announcements, not confirmations, but shifts. Small, almost invisible adjustments in language, funding patterns, and research priorities. Aerospace journals started revisiting long-abandoned concepts under new names. Defense contractors quietly issued tenders for endurance-focused platforms that didn't specify fuel type. Universities reopened grant categories that had been dormant for decades. None of this proves the flight occurred, but it suggests something unsettled the system. Because when an industry is confident a claim is false, it moves on. It doesn't recheck its assumptions. It doesn't update its models. It doesn't quietly ask, what if we were wrong? And yet, that's what appears to be happening here. Engineers who reviewed the fragments noticed something else, something more troubling. The reported flight path didn't maximize distance. It maximized time. That distinction matters. Distance records are about efficiency. Time records are about stability. Holding an aircraft in sustained equilibrium for days requires not just power, but control systems capable of compensating for atmospheric changes minute by minute, hour by hour. Wind shear, temperature gradients, electrical storms, solar flux. Conventional aircraft avoid these variables by outrunning them or landing. This one didn't, which raises the possibility that propulsion wasn't the limiting factor, regulation was. Because if a system can maintain lift and control indefinitely, the airframe becomes less like a vehicle and more like a platform. One that doesn't need to return. One that doesn't need a base. One that blurs the line between aircraft and infrastructure. That idea makes regulators nervous. Certification frameworks are built around failure modes, engine-out scenarios, fuel exhaustion, emergency landings. But how do you certify something designed not to land? How do you define risk when endurance isn't bounded by fuel capacity? You don't. You stall. And stalling can look exactly like what we're seeing now: ambiguity, silence, and no comment. Meanwhile, skeptics continue to point out the obvious: no verified payload data, no independent instrumentation, no officially logged airspace clearance matching the full duration. These criticisms are valid, necessary even. But here's the paradox. If the claim were purely fabricated, disproving it would be easy. A single authoritative release of radar data would end the discussion. A clear explanation of misinterpreted signals would close the case. Yet instead, the story remains suspended, not confirmed, not debunked, just unresolved. And unresolved stories don't stay small. They attract private testing, parallel research, competing prototypes. Because in high-stakes engineering, no one wants to be the organization that ignored the one anomaly that mattered. So while the public debates belief versus skepticism, something else is unfolding out of view. Calculations are being rerun. Assumptions are being loosened. Limits are being quietly questioned. And that's why this may already be one of the most controversial flights in aviation history, even if no official record is ever recognized. Because controversy isn't measured by medals or certificates. It's measured by what people are afraid to rule out. And as long as that remains true, this flight, real, partial, or misunderstood, will continue to hover in the same uncomfortable space. And that space between certainty and possibility is where aviation has always been reborn. Every major leap began there. Not with applause, but with arguments. Not with clarity, but with unease. The Wright brothers weren't believed because their plane was elegant. They were believed because, eventually, it refused to stop working. Jet engines weren't trusted because they were faster. They were trusted because they kept flying when skeptics expected flameouts. Endurance has always been the real proof. And that's why this alleged 72-hour flight won't fade quietly. Because even critics who reject the explanation admit something uncomfortable. The data fragments behave more like incomplete truth than complete fiction. Hoaxes tend to be loud, sloppy, overconfident. This one is restrained, technically cautious, almost defensive, which suggests whoever released the information understood scrutiny would come and structured the claim to survive it. But there's another layer most discussions ignore: human endurance. A 3-day flight isn't just a machine problem. It's a biological one. Pilot fatigue, cognitive decline, microsleep, decision degradation, these are well-studied limits. And yet reports suggest the aircraft maintained stable operation without the erratic control inputs typically associated with exhaustion. That points to automation. Not autopilot as we know it, but autonomy. Systems capable of maintaining lift, navigation, and stability without continuous human intervention. If true, that alone would place this aircraft ahead of anything publicly acknowledged. Because endurance without autonomy is impossible, and autonomy without failure tolerance is dangerous. Which means if the system exists, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't improvised. It was designed for persistence, not demonstration. That realization shifts the narrative again. Suddenly, the flight looks less like a publicity stunt and more like a proof of concept that wasn't meant for headlines at all. Something tested quietly, perhaps prematurely exposed, and now impossible to put back into the shadows. And that explains the contradiction we keep seeing. Bold claims followed by restraint. Extraordinary implications followed by silence. As if the people closest to the project understand exactly how destabilizing confirmation would be. Because the moment sustained, fuel-independent flight is acknowledged, even partially, aviation timelines fracture. Decades of roadmap assumptions become negotiable. Defense doctrines shift. Surveillance ethics change. Border enforcement rethinks endurance. Cargo logistics reconsider gravity itself. And once those conversations begin, they can't be controlled. So instead, the story lingers. Not alive enough to celebrate. Not dead enough to bury. Just present enough to force a question every serious engineer eventually asks themselves, usually in private. What if the limit we're defending isn't a law of physics, but a habit of thinking? And if that's true, then the most controversial part of this flight isn't how long it stayed in the air. It's how long it has stayed in the conversation without landing. Because stories like this don't end with answers, they end by changing what questions are allowed to be asked. And quietly, that shift is already happening. Engineers who once dismissed the idea outright now phrase their objections differently. Not "this violates physics," but "this would require a mechanism we don't currently model." That distinction matters. One closes a door. The other admits a hallway might exist, even if no one knows where it leads. Meanwhile, parallel research paths begin to converge. Advances in materials science reduce structural fatigue. Adaptive control algorithms learn to predict atmospheric instability before it forms. Energy harvesting concepts, once relegated to theory, are revisited with modern instrumentation. None of these alone explain a 72-hour flight, but together, they hint at a system-level approach, one that doesn't rely on a single miracle, but on many small advantages stacked with intention. And that's often how real revolutions happen. Not as a breakthrough moment, but as an accumulation that only looks impossible when viewed in isolation. What unsettles critics most isn't the claim of endurance. It's the absence of a clear ceiling. Traditional aircraft performance curves always flatten. Fuel limits range. Maintenance limits time. Crews limit continuity. This curve doesn't flatten. If sustained flight is decoupled from fuel mass, then endurance becomes a function of reliability alone. And reliability improves. It doesn't cap. That idea doesn't just challenge aviation norms, it destabilizes certification logic itself. Because the question regulators are trained to ask is, what happens when it runs out? But what if it doesn't? What if the failure mode isn't exhaustion, but interruption? Not depletion, but interference? That reframes risk entirely. And it may explain why official responses remain cautious, procedural, and deliberately incomplete. Acknowledging the possibility without validating the mechanism keeps the system intact, for now. Yet curiosity has momentum. Independent teams continue to simulate the reported parameters. Some conclude it's impossible. Others conclude it's unlikely. A few conclude something far more dangerous to consensus. That it's conditionally feasible. And conditionally feasible is the most destabilizing phrase in engineering. It means the barrier isn't nature, it's understanding. So the flight remains aloft, metaphorically, because grounding it would require certainty. And certainty is exactly what no one seems ready to claim. Not the supporters. Not the skeptics. Not the institutions tasked with saying no. Which leaves the rest of us watching the same sky, asking the same unresolved question in different ways. If this aircraft didn't do what was claimed, why hasn't the story fallen apart? And if it did, even partially, what else have we assumed was impossible simply because it arrived too early, from the wrong place, with the wrong explanation?